We now move into actually the more academic part of the program. We will have a series of presentations, each about 30 minutes, from a variety of scholars, all relating to theological, historical, or canonical questions related to the lay engagement with the church around these issues. We'll have both presentations, two at this point, in order. Then we will have questions and answers for both speakers, hopefully a rather lengthy period of time. We'll go to about 12:15. I would note that there will be a light lunch provided. I have been told to keep lunch expectations low, so I should stress light lunch. But for our two speakers for this morning's session, first we will have Professor Christopher Ruddy of the School of Theology and Religious Studies here at Catholic University. He's a graduate of Yale, Harvard, and Notre Dame. He taught for an extended period of time at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, before joining the faculty here at the Catholic University of America. He is the author of Tested in Every Way, The Catholic Priesthood in Today's Church. Professor Ruddy. And there is a handout. You should have a handout. If you don't have a handout, please put your hand up, and you will get one in short order.
Okay. Can everybody hear me with this? I prefer to stand when I talk. Professor Ruddy said this is going to be the more academic portion. I hope that doesn't mean that this is sleepy time for everybody. My students can tell you something about that. I'm grateful to President Garvey for his initiative in organizing this series of conferences, and to Professor Joe Capizzi and Steve Higgins and the staff of the Institute for Human Ecology in putting this all together. It takes a lot of work. Thank you. You'll also see that President Garvey has stolen my intro, which I'll have to take up with him. My parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary this past August. They are my heroes, not least for their selflessness and unfailing attentiveness to others. Early on in my marriage, I remember my mom, who was not a preachy person at all, saying, "The most important thing in marriage is trust." She didn't say romance or compatibility or even love. "Without trust," she continued, "you have nothing." In my 19 years of marriage, I've seen that borne out time and again. I know that my wife, Deborah, has my back, that she's always willing and acting for my good. I never have to worry that she's undermining me or even just pursuing some kind of personal agenda apart from me. That trust is the foundation on which our love has been built. If love is the greatest of gifts, as St. Paul reminded us this past Sunday, trust is the most necessary for any relationship. And trust, of course, is precisely what has been ruptured, violated so deeply by the sexual abuse crisis, which began or publicly reared its head in 1985 in the United States, emerged yet again in 1992 and 93, exploded radioactively in Boston in 2002, and almost unbelievably burst out again this past summer with the twin blows of the Pennsylvania grand jury report and the allegations that the now former Cardinal McCarrick had sexually abused both boys and seminarians. Today's conference is devoted, as we know, to the theme, Healing the Breach of Trust, Laity, Leadership, and the Crisis. My assigned topic is the engagement of the laity in Vatican II. My thesis is that the crisis of trust flows from the repeated failure on the part of numerous church leaders to be, among other things, honest, to be truthful. Lies, obfuscations, evasions, self-protective behavior, happy talk, and a lack of courage in truth-telling have undermined the trust that is essential for any effective exercise of authority. It is one thing to sin and to fail. It is another thing to cover up, hide, and avoid. Bishops, priests, deacons, and religious all have roles to play in healing that breach of trust. One of the things that has struck me most over the past few months, for instance, is the commitment of many priests, and especially newer bishops, to contribute to that reform. But today I'll focus on the contribution that the laity might make to healing that breach of trust in light of the teaching of Vatican II. I have no illusions that the laity are a silver bullet solution. Just like clergy and religious, the laity are sinners. We are prone to corruption, blindness, ambition, careerism, greed, lust, and the like. Conversely, and it's a sad fallout from this crisis that I even have to say this, neither are the clergy an evil, undifferentiated mass of evil. So many bishops, priests, and deacons are good, holy men. They are just as angry as the laity are at the sins and crimes of their brothers. But in a particular way, it is the laity's voice that needs to be heard anew today. I'll proceed in 3 steps. First, I'll speak briefly about the nature of this crisis. Second, I'll sketch the main themes of Vatican II's teaching on the laity and their mission in the Church. And third, in light of that vision, I'll indicate some ways forward for laity and clergy alike. The theme for this series of conference, Healing the Breach of Trust, Laity Leadership in the Crisis, raises the question, which crisis? If we don't answer that question correctly, our subsequent responses will fall short or be counterproductive and even harmful. So, which crisis? The crisis of the clerical sexual abuse of minors, the failure of bishops and other church leaders to respond rightly to that abuse? Is it a crisis caused by priestly celibacy, homosexuality, clericalism? Is it about sex abuse? Is it about power abuse? The abuse of prepubescent children? The abuse of postpubescent children? The abuse of vulnerable and subordinate adults? All of these aspects have their role to play. But in my judgment, what makes 2018 and 2019 different from even the events of 2002 has been the hornet's nest surrounding the former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, something that Cardinal DiNardo alluded to. As we all know, sadly enough, what he has done and what he has failed to do. All indications are that he will soon be dismissed from the clerical state. Furthermore, we now know that his former dioceses of Metuchen and Newark settled several cases alleging his sexual abuse and harassment of seminarians. Subsequent journalistic investigation by Catholic News Agency and some other outlets, and the explosive series of letters by Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano have raised grave, as yet unanswered questions concerning who knew about his sexual and likely financial corruption, who protected him and helped him rise in the Church's hierarchy, and the nature of the discipline that Pope Benedict imposed on him. McCarrick's case is a perfect storm in which virtually all dimensions of the crisis collide with each other. His case is thus a kind of apotheosis, a condensed symbol of the systemic rot involved in the sexual abuse crisis. The particulars of his case, though, reveal a much wider deformation in the Church as a whole. This is the crisis of trust. When truth is scarce or absent, some laity don't trust some clergy. Some clergy don't trust their bishops. Some bishops and the Pope don't seem to trust each other. How then can we move forward in such wrenching times? The late French Dominican and Cardinal Yves Congar shows one possible path. By any standard, Congar is the most significant ecclesiologist of the 20th century, and likely the greatest single theological influence on the documents of Vatican II. In 1950, he wrote what remains the definitive work on church reform, called True and False Reform in the Church. In that book, he speaks about 3 types of reform, 2 true and 1 false. The first type of reform is what he calls a reform of abuses. This type of true reform works in the realm of already given structures and practices. More pastoral than doctrinal, it seeks a more exacting observance of church discipline. Think of the Council of Trent mandating that bishops live in their dioceses and be present there during Holy Week. The second type of reform is what Congar calls doctrinal revolution. This false reform unacceptably calls into question some aspect of the Church's dogmatic, sacramental, and hierarchical nature. Congar sees Martin Luther as the classic example of such revolutionary reform, even if he's somewhat sympathetic to the concerns that motivated Luther's efforts. The third type of reform, I think, is the most important for our purposes here. It seeks what Congar calls a reform of a state of affairs. The French is état de choses, a mindset, a culture. This culture change, so to speak, is less specific than a reform of abuses. It instead seeks systemic reform and often calls for, in Congar's words, quote, new men and women who aren't prisoners of the system, end quote, who can question the system and find new ways forward. Most deeply, this reform involves a recentering on Christ and his paschal mystery. St. Francis of Assisi is Congar's exemplar of such reform. And I think it's no accident that St. Francis's efforts at reform began before the crucifix at San Damiano. Francis, rebuild my church, which, as you see, is falling into ruins. These are strong words from a strong-willed theologian and churchman in Congar. But I believe that this change of mindset is the most needed type of reform today when facing a crisis of trust. And I think that Vatican II offers a way forward for such ecclesial renewal. Vatican II did many things, of course, and at unprecedented length. But its teaching on the laity is marked both by its doctrinal content and its style. First, the council style. The Jesuit historian John O'Malley has noted that Vatican II adopted a largely epidictic style of rhetoric, which seeks not so much to be scholastic, to clarify concepts, as to heighten appreciation, to excite emulation of an ideal. It works by way of persuasion, not coercion. Vatican II, in O'Malley's view, is, quote, moved from the dialectic of winning an argument to the dialogue of finding common ground, end quote. This style or genre makes the conciliar documents inspiring in places, even poetic, but also sometimes ambiguous, sometimes deliberately so. There's something for just about everybody in those documents. O'Malley notes that this conciliar rhetoric of appreciation and ideals has a corresponding vocabulary. Absent, for better and worse, is the canonical and legislative language of preceding councils. What emerges instead are horizontal or equality words, brothers and sisters, collegiality, reciprocity words, partnership, collaboration, dialogue, humility words, pilgrim, servant, change or empowerment words, development, progress, participation, and interiority words, charism, conscience, holiness. This last word, holiness, leads to the heart of the matter. Although Vatican II is often known for its teaching on episcopal collegiality and papal primacy, on ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, on liturgy, to name only a few, O'Malley makes the striking observation that perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lumen Gentium is its 5th chapter on the universal call to holiness in the church. That chapter of the council's most important document on the church said, quote, explicitly, forcefully, and for the first time ever in a council, that holiness is what the church is all about, what human life is all about, end quote. Moreover, the council makes clear that all believers are called to the same standard of holiness. Listen to this line from Lumen Gentium, quote, it is evident to everyone that all the faithful of Christ, of whatever rank or status, are called to the fullness of the Christian life and to the perfection of charity, end quote. Vatican II's teaching on the laity unfolds from within that universal call to holiness and is one of the council's signature achievements, in my view. Near the beginning of the 4th chapter, which is devoted to the laity, Lumen Gentium offers a definition of the laity. You'll see it on the back of the handout, the first quote on there, so I won't read it at length. But this definition or description of the laity highlights 4 dimensions. Baptism as the foundation of Christian life and equality, Christ's threefold office of priest, prophet, and king, the laity's participation in the mission of the church in the world, and 4th, secularity. Given that my colleague Mike Root will speak this afternoon about the laity's priestly and prophetic and kingly roles, I'll comment just briefly on the others. First, Lumen Gentium grounds lay identity in baptism. Baptism is what makes us Christi Fidelis, Christ's faithful ones. It makes us members of his body. Baptism is the foundational, most necessary sacrament of Christian life, and it creates an equal dignity among all the faithful, whatever their state in life. Second, the laity share in the mission of the whole Christian people in the church and in the world. According to the Council, the laity are appointed to this mission, quote, by the Lord himself, end quote, through the sacraments of baptism and confirmation. Mission is rooted sacramentally and intrinsically, not juridically and extrinsically. Third, the laity are distinctively characterized by their secularity, their worldly character and mission. Such secularity differs from secularism, which would banish God from the worldly or temporal realm. This secularity is the special vocation and distinctive task of the laity, to order all worldly and temporal goods to the kingdom of God. This secular vocation, according to Vatican II, is not a runner-up prize for those not called to, quote, the sacred. The Council's emphasis on the laity's distinctive secular mission, though, should not be used to effectively say, the laity take care of the world and the clergy take care of the church. It's not a rigid division of labor. From one perspective, the entire church, clergy and religious included, has a secular character and mission. Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 40. From another perspective, the laity have a rightful, necessary role to play in the church. Some exercise that role through direct ecclesial employment. People who work for chanceries, people who work for the bishops' conference, lay ecclesial ministers. Others do so through involvements in various church organizations and associations. Perhaps most directly pertinent, though, for our discussion today is Lumen Gentium's often overlooked section 37 on laity-clergy relationships. That section, I think, tends to be somewhat idealistic, and it can seem like a soft, frictionless, and ultimately impotent or unrealistic section. This is a perennial danger of the Council's consensual, conciliatory rhetoric. But that section sets an essential, indispensable tone for laity-clergy relationships. It says that the laity are called to make their needs and desires known to clergy with freedom and with confidence. The laity likewise have the right and even the duty to express their opinion on matters pertaining to the good of the church to their pastors. They are also called to obey their pastors, following the example of Christ's own obedience. The clergy, for their part, must respect the dignity of the laity in the church, even, quote, willingly using their prudent advice and confidently assigning offices to them in the service of the church, end quote. The clergy are also called to foster lay initiative and to respect the legitimate freedom of the laity in temporal matters. This familiar or familial relationship between laity and clergy strengthens the church for, quote, its mission for the life of the world, end quote. We see in this section all of O'Malley's vocabulary: equality words, reciprocity words, humility words, empowerment words, interiority words. I think it's striking that so much of what the Council said here was taken up almost verbatim into some parts of the Code of Canon Law, Canon 212 in particular. Vatican II's style, or rhetoric, and its content thus offer what Congar meant by a reform of a state of affairs, a reform of mindset and culture. They deliberately and repeatedly speak of the laity-clergy relationship in terms of equality, opportunity, openness, confidence, trust, boldness. And I hope that these are the principles that guide the third concluding section of my paper. What are the steps forward? Equality, but not sameness, is the essential point of departure here. A sense of inequality even a sometimes well-intentioned paternalist sense of trying to protect supposedly naive, innocent laity from scandal, fed the problem. It fostered a distance in which abusive clergy were more visible and real to church leaders than victims and survivors were. Writing in 2002, just a few months after the sex abuse crisis broke in Boston, the Notre Dame theologian John Cavadini noted the following. This is the second quote on the back of your handout. To this clerical culture, and especially its highest reaches, where the bishops and their closest priest associates reside, the laity and their concerns seem mostly invisible. How else can you explain the complaints of mothers and fathers that their serious worries about how their children were being treated were dismissed or evaded or given the runaround? There is no sense that these are our children, the church's children, but rather your children, those of the laity, whose duty is to listen and submit. In fact, the only way to explain this without invoking the deepest kind of active malice is by distance, end quote. That passage has stayed with me nearly 20 years. Some steps forward in this way are what Congar called reforms of abuses. My colleague, Sister Nancy Bauer, will delve more deeply this afternoon into the sort of canonical possibilities for lay engagement. So I'll offer only a few brief suggestions. Greater lay participation in parochial, diocesan, national, and international organisms of communication, review boards. I think that lay involvement on priest personnel boards and episcopal nominations would be a good step towards accountability and transparency. And as it stands, there is little opportunity for laity to have structured input or feedback on the pastoral effectiveness of their priests. Likewise, advancement to the episcopate depends largely on the evaluation of priests by bishops. The evaluations of priests, deacons, and especially laity often count for little. Accountability tends to flow upwards only, not downwards. I'd add here the promise of what a number of American bishops, such as Edward Scharfenberger of Albany and Sean McKnight of Jefferson City, Missouri, have said about the prospect of lay involvement in boards reviewing allegations of abuse against bishops. I have on the flip side of the handout the entire text of a statement that Bishop Scharfenberger released, I think not accidentally, on the Feast of the Transfiguration, August 6, 2018. I'll read some parts from this. I think we have reached a point where bishops alone investigating bishops is not the answer. It is time for us, I believe, to call forth the talents and charisms of our lay faithful by virtue of their baptismal priesthood. What is needed now is an independent commission led by well-respected, faithful lay leaders who are beyond reproach. We bishops want to rise to this challenge, which may well be our last opportunity considering all that has happened. We must get this right. We need an investigation, and it must be timely, transparent, and credible. The more difficult and necessary steps, however, I think involve what Congar called a reform of a state of affairs or culture. This is where Cavadini's distance is most pernicious. First is what Yves Congar called the system, and what Ross Douthat of the New York Times just this past Sunday called, quote, the ransacked, decaying basilica that is American Catholicism, end quote. Strong words. What is this system? This is how we do things. That's just the way it is. What are you going to do? The shrugging of shoulders at careerism, corruption, duplicity, double lives. I've worked with the USCCB for 13 years on ecumenical matters, not on staff, but as a participant in dialogues. And I've attended several meetings and conferences organized by the Committee on Doctrine. With very few exceptions, the bishops were respectful, good listeners. They were eager to be helpful. They wanted to hear. I had no sense whatsoever that they regarded me or other lay people in the room as inferior or second rate. There was no clericalism in that sense. Sometimes, though, I did detect a sense of, we know how things work around here. In this view, laity can be seen as good, well-intentioned, generous, but somewhat naive about how things really work. I think that bishops sometimes sell laity short. The American layman and journalist Russell Shaw, who spent nearly 20 years as the communications director for the American bishops, has written that church leaders, quote, might be surprised at what fast learners the laity can be if given the chance, end quote. There's also, with this greater involvement of the laity, the need not just for insiders, but outsiders who don't work for the church in one way or another. Outsiders who can say, why do you do things this way? Not out of a sense of criticism, but out of curiosity, who aren't habituated to familiar patterns. A second theme of culture reform, seminary formation. Although some might argue that clerical distance would be reduced or eliminated by the priestly ordination of married men, I think that the issue is much more complex. There are numerous closed and self-protective cultures populated overwhelmingly by non-celibates. Think of physicians and police, for instance. The greater challenge, I think, pertains to the formation of clergy, and it is here that the laity have an essential, irreplaceable role to play. Please allow me an anecdote here. College and graduate school can be self-absorbed times. I remember a doctoral classmate of mine, a religious sister who had spent years in primary and secondary education, saying that doctoral work felt so selfish. Like many college and graduate students, I spent my student years largely isolated from family life, especially from children. Some classmates were married and had children, but they seemed to live in a parallel universe to mine. As a husband and a father, I now cringe at my obliviousness then. I've taught at Catholic U for 10 years, and over that decade I've taught ecclesiology to hundreds of seminarians. Although I see seminarians primarily in the classroom and have no role in their spiritual pastoral formation, I've been pleased by the quality of the men. Less than a handful out of those hundreds have struck me as manifestly unfit for priestly ministry, not due to criminal activity, but just to personality or relational skills. By and large, they strike me as good, generous men who want to serve Christ and his church at a very difficult time in which the priesthood has little social prestige. I don't see much evidence of the, quote, little monsters that some fear them to be. Some of the seminarians who have most impressed me in this regard, who have been the least clericalist in the sense of having some kind of superiority complex to the laity, are some of the seminarians from Redemptoris Mater, the Archdiocesan Seminary conducted by the Neo-Catechumenal Way. I'm not a member of that community, but having seen these seminarians before and after their ordination, I'm always struck by the way they combine a clear sense of priestly identity with a remarkable closeness to the laity. From the outside, I think that their closeness comes from the fact that they spend their entire formation embedded in small communities of families. They receive constant support, feedback, and even criticism from these families. They are grounded. They are pastoral and responsive. They are unmistakably priests, and they are close to their people. Closeness and clerical identity aren't contradictory, but reinforce each other. Such accompaniment leading to friendship, I think, is the very best antidote to the clericalist distance that John Cavadini decries. Conversely, it is also the case that too many lay people perpetuate or at least acquiesce in clericalism themselves. Passivity can be quite comfortable and is certainly less demanding, but the universal call to holiness is demanding like nothing else. Third and finally, truth-telling as a part of this reform of culture, mindset, state of affairs. Believers have a right to know the truth on a natural level and the supernatural level. And the nature of the church as communion positively demands open, forthright, and truthful communication. Communion requires communication. I owe that insight to Russell Shaw. Secrecy is one obvious ongoing communications problem, But Russell Shaw has singled out what he calls spin and happy talk as especially pernicious. What is happy talk? Shaw calls it, quote, the dismissal of signs of crisis and decline in the church as matters of little importance, painful at the time perhaps, but somehow beneficial in the long run. Such distortions and denials of reality confer legitimacy upon abusive and destructive practices, end quote. Happy talk is not harmless. It's not simply blowing hot air. It is corrosive of truthfulness and of openness. It is wrong to speak to laity or any members of the church as if they are well-intentioned but ultimately dim children who need to be humored or managed or kept in the dark. The Pennsylvania grand jury report, deeply flawed though it may be, as Peter Steinfels has recently argued, turned my stomach with grief and disbelief at the depravity of sexual abuse. But it is Cardinal Wuerl's obfuscation that has made me angrier than anything over this past year, because it has shown how deeply ingrained such obfuscation is in the church's clerical and hierarchical culture, even after all of the events of the past 8 months. If the cardinal did not lie about his knowledge of McCarrick's history of predation and corruption and exposed his own seminarians to that predation, he at the very least has not told the whole truth. He did not intend to enlighten, but with lawyerly precision and impersonality, to obfuscate and possibly to mislead. His January 15th letter to his priests didn't really apologize to his priests for what he called his lapse of memory, and he has left his own priests hanging in public. Moreover, he has failed to address his people, the laity, directly at all for several months. This is a father who, despite his talents and long years of service, has too often given stones, not bread. The church needs an investigation into the whole McCarrick scandal of sex, money, and power that, in the words of Bishop Scharfenberger, is, quote, timely, transparent, and credible, end quote. The Pope alone can authorize such an investigation. Stonewalling, temporizing, demonizing, and dismissing are not acceptable responses. Catholics, especially in this instance, the most devoted laity, clergy, and religious alike, are hurting because of a lack of truth and transparency, even at the highest levels of the church. Such haughty evasiveness cripples the church's credibility and its mission. It makes trust difficult, even impossible for some. And in a particular way, it manifests distance, condescension, and even contempt for the laity, as well as the so-called lower clergy, priests and deacons. It is a scandal of its own. This is a far way away from Vatican II's vision of the universal call to holiness and the complementary equality of laity and clergy. As I said at the beginning of this talk, the Catholic laity are not silver bullets in this present crisis of trust. We have our own creaturely and sinful limits. But Vatican II offers a promising vision of equality, communion, openness, and collaboration that calls out for fulfillment, especially in the present crisis. And ultimately, the best remedy to the crisis of trust in the church is the one given in the letter of James. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no, that you may not fall under condemnation. Thank you.
Our second presentation this morning, moving from theology to history, is from Dr. Bronwen McShea. She is a graduate of Harvard, the Harvard Divinity School, and did her doctoral work at Yale. She has taught at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She's the author of Apostles of Empire, the Jesuits in New France, and of a striking piece in First Things last fall entitled Bishops Unbound on the clergy crisis, which I would certainly urge you to Google and read. Dr. McShea is this year a visiting fellow at the James Madison Institute at Princeton University. Dr. McShea.
Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me okay? First, I'd just also like to express my thanks to President Garvey and everyone at the Institute for Human Ecology who organized this event, and I appreciate the invitation to speak today. I came of age as a Catholic toward the end of John Paul II's pontificate, decades after Vatican II was promulgated. So, all my life, I've been told enthusiastically by Catholic leaders that the laity is more valued by the clerical hierarchy and more active in the church than ever before. In 2006, for example, Avery Cardinal Dulles, S.J., a fellow Harvard alum, just FYI, summed things up this way. Quote, "Throughout the Middle Ages and early modern times, lay people ordinarily played a rather passive role in the church. Then things really changed in the 20th century. The popes newly began to involve the laity in the ministry of the church, and the work of Vatican II, especially, bore fruit in the greater collaboration seen among priests, religious, and lay faithful in the proclamation of the Word of God, in catechesis, and in a great variety of services increasingly entrusted to the laity." That's mostly Dulles, I was quoting there, with a few adjustments there. Now, as a Catholic lay woman, especially, who developed interests in church history, I've been taught to be especially grateful to have been born into this age of the laity, and not into one of those grim, long centuries before the 20th. And indeed, I've been able to pursue a career after obtaining degrees in theological studies as well as history, teaching and writing on topics such as the history of the Jesuits, early modern Catholicism, and Christian missions across the globe, with friends in the priesthood and religious life cheering me on, like this is a very natural thing for a laywoman to do. But now the church that I love and have felt so at home in is engulfed in the crisis that brings us together today. And I confess, in view of both the crisis and all the history I've absorbed these many years, many affirming statements about the laity by churchmen of the past half century have begun to seem a bit plastic and hollow to me. Because when it comes, for example, to achieving real justice for victims and perpetrators of clerical sexual abuse and its cover-up by some of the church's leading shepherds, how helpless and frustrated so many faithful laymen and women seem to be. How at the mercy, too, I would say, of opaque decision-making, of closed-door dealings by upper management and central planners, so to speak, in chanceries, national bishops' councils, and the Vatican. In this age of the laity, laypersons are surely busy with many, many things for the church, many of them traditionally done by clergymen and religious. We are seen, for example, at church lecterns, distributing communion, instructing catechumens, giving spiritual direction, staffing ecclesiastical tribunals, leading theology faculties. In some ways, simply from the vantage point of historical divisions of labor in the church, the laity has become more clericalized than ever before. Yet at the same time, roles traditionally acknowledged, sometimes begrudgingly, by church authorities to be proper to the laity, such as sharing in the organization, the day-to-day governance, and disciplining of the church, understood as a polity or visible community of the baptized, are now considered very strictly to belong to the clerical hierarchy alone. Dulles himself insisted in this vein that although the laity participate actively in the church in new ways, governing the people of God belongs by divine right to the Pope and the bishops, assisted by other members of the clergy. Now, such words by a Vatican II-era churchman might actually have made some medieval and early modern churchmen blush a bit, given the degree to which they actually shared real power over the church's common life with Catholic lay rulers and social elites. To put it bluntly, in this age of the laity have no sword, no juridical structural powers within and for the church to actively assist and, where necessary, pressure the clerical hierarchy in holding its wayward and corrupt members to account for wounds they inflict on the whole body of Christ. The laity, at least some members of it, used to have such a sword in historical contexts such as medieval Christendom and Catholic states like old regime France, settings in which the church's common life was expressed in concretely political and social terms, in very different ways than are possible today, of course. The clerical hierarchy in those days, acknowledging that at least some laypersons were leaders in the church alongside them, expected the laity to wield that sword to help protect and discipline the church in the secular or social and material dimensions of her existence. Let me sketch out some examples from medieval and early modern times. First, let's consider the region of Normandy in late medieval France. There, more than a third of all churches were officially under lay patronage, which meant that local lay elites held the right to appoint the church's priests and control parish buildings, lands, and revenues. Still other churches, while formally under the patronage of bishops, were in practice governed by still other lay elites. The rest were controlled directly by a mix of bishops, abbots, and other monastics. Interestingly, the lay patrons tended to absorb upward far less of the church's revenues than did their often more cash-strapped clerical counterparts. Also, there appears to have been little difference in terms of the moral caliber of clergymen advanced by the laity versus those advanced by other churchmen. Lay patrons tended to discipline clergy accused, for example, of sexual offenses, more or less to the same degree that bishops did. Sometimes lay patrons were more zealous in this regard than churchmen. Fast forward to 16th century Italy. Archival sources detail the case of a priest who repeatedly sexually abused a teenage boy in the city of Loreto in 1569 and 1570. The governor of Loreto, a layman, pushed Cardinal della Rovere, then Loreto's temporal and spiritual shepherd, to investigate. The cardinal responded quickly to the governor's concerns. The priest was investigated, imprisoned, tried, and found guilty in an ecclesiastical court. Then, within a few months, in keeping with a juridical norm of the church at the time, not always enforced, he was defrocked and handed over to secular lay Catholic authorities who executed justice swiftly in the form of decapitation. I'm not advocating that, just FYI. Historians get into their subject a bit. Fast forward again to 17th and 18th century France. In that still very Catholic society, despite the directions very small elite minorities in Paris and other cities were going by then in France, criminal cases were regularly, if not frequently, brought against clergymen by lay accusers in secular courts, not only through the ecclesiastical court system. And there it was considered unremarkable, indeed consistent with good order and the spiritual well-being of the whole Catholic community, that if a priest violated a member of the laity, lay accusers, lawyers, and judges had some customary rights to pursue justice. Thus, in 1727, for example, a parish pastor in Provence was convicted and hanged by secular authorities for his crime, note this, of spiritual incest with a young woman in his parish whom he had seduced. In 1731, the highest level secular court in Aix-en-Provence tried a prominent Jesuit for the same crime. I believe the Jesuits slipped away, as they sometimes do. He was tried for the same crime, spiritual incest, with a laywoman with whom he had a confessor-penitent relationship. Now, in that deeply Catholic society, secular authorities didn't speak of, quote, consensual sexual relationships between adults, unquote, when one party was a priest and the other, however old, was under his spiritually paternal care. In 1757, likewise, the curé of Loudre in Lorraine was sentenced by secular lay authorities to be burned at the stake for sexual misconduct with a young man. And in 1783, a Capuchin monk who had sexually assaulted and stabbed, not to death, a young 14-year-old boy was tried and executed by secular authorities in Paris by being broken on a wheel and burned alive in public. Although he could have asserted clerical immunity to be tried first in an ecclesiastical court, no churchman emboldened him to do so, apparently because they didn't wish to seem to be going out of their way to protect clerics guilty of pederasty. Of course, there are many, many examples, too, of clerical sexual misconduct, including some involving very young victims being covered up by medieval and early modern churchmen, sometimes to avoid public scandal, sometimes because the guilty clergyman had powerful friends or family members. Still, it just wasn't so very rare, despite clerical immunities on the books in Catholic political societies, for clergymen to be investigated, prosecuted, and sometimes punished by lay Catholic authorities. Now, of course, the laity, for the most part, lost its sword within and for the church during the era when Catholic political regimes were toppled by liberal and nationalist revolutionaries, some of whom were openly anti-Catholic and anti-clerical in motivation. So suddenly, if one was a concerned Catholic layman working, say, for the French governmental bureaucracy, one had new scruples about subjecting clergymen to the police powers and juridical arm of an aggressively secularizing, expanding nation-state. And in nations like the young USA, which started life as a culturally Protestant and assertively liberal nation, Catholic laypersons never had much of an ecclesial sword to begin with. When they attempted to wield one, in the sense of asserting rights of governance over local churches, as in the trusteeism controversies, they were brought to heel by church authorities who were responding at that time to the geopolitical and cultural situation of modernity by concentrating more and more power within and over the common life of the church into the hands of the Pope and the bishops to try to protect the church to some degree from the changing political states that are developing, that are secularizing. Now, this is an historical argument I've advanced in an article published in First Things in January. I can only rehash it cursorily here. Several developments that played out from the mid-19th century up until the 1980s, even the mid-19th century seems very recent to me as an early modernist. So several developments that played out over this period up until our own lifetime, when viewed together, help us grasp various evolved structural barriers in the modern church that discourage serious lay involvement in the pursuit of justice for abuse and cover-up victims and perpetrators. These include the increasing centralization and regularization of diocesan institutions so that they were formally answerable only to the clerical hierarchy, and especially the papacy, and no longer so beholden as in the past to a mix of local lay, clerical, and religious patrons and governing bodies. The period also saw more absolutized assertions of immediate jurisdiction, in more sort of legalized terms, over the whole body of the faithful by the Pope at Vatican I, and through the decree Christus Dominus by the College of Bishops at Vatican II. The College of Bishops kind of consolidated in a new way in their self-articulation into a more centralized layer of worldwide ecclesial governance, and I would also say a much more bureaucratized layer of governance. This comes out of Vatican II, it seems to me, with national bishops' conferences suddenly springing up everywhere. There was also the dramatic supersession of the centuries-old discipline of ecclesiastical jurisprudence by the streamlined, modernized Code of Canon Law of 1917, and then again the major revision of the code in 1983. Developments that, among other things, walled off the church's internal legal system in which the clergy have more rights than laypersons, even more than before, from political and lay scrutiny, the latter of which was increasingly characterized as interference with inner church affairs from outside the church. Specific changes in canon law also ensured that for the first time in history, nearly all bishops would be selected by the Vatican, not by diverse traditional authorities, laypersons sometimes included, as had been the norm in Christendom and the Tridentine era. The 1983 code, furthermore, ended an ancient practice of installing parish pastors permanently newly subjecting the office of pastor to term limits that could be imposed by national bishops' conferences. And also subjecting the office, I would say, to new pressures on priests themselves to always stay on the right side of chanceries, lest they be demoted to another parish. But not only has it become the norm in the USA and other countries for priests to get moved from parish to parish multiple times in their careers, but the Vatican also regularly now authorizes reassignments of bishops from diocese to diocese, encouraging already strong tendencies toward careerism and lack of accountability to local rooted populations in the episcopate. And if I could, an aside here, I appreciated President Garvey's metaphor of marriage as a helpful metaphor. And I agree with that, the idea that bishops are married to the church. But the metaphor with the current structure, there's a bit of a challenge because bishops they leave their diocese every once in a while, whereas the sort of lay faithful of the diocese get sort of a new spouse every so often. So there's a bit of an imbalance in the structure that actually I think makes the marriage metaphor difficult for the bishops to apply. They're less burdened with it than the laity are, I believe. Now, amid such changes that I've just sort of cataloged, some top-down unilateral changes were made to how cases of clerical sexual misconduct were handled. Now, I'm not an expert on this, so if anyone knows, if there are ways to correct me on this, please do so afterwards. But from what I understand, several papal instructions, for example, in 1866, 1922, and 1962, newly favored absolute secrecy among church officials in such cases, departing from traditional norms of involving secular officials where clerical sexual crimes were at issue. Now, the current crisis, I would say, is revealing more than before a considerable chasm between, on the one hand, the juridical structural reality regarding who gets to discipline straying, corrupt members of the church's body, and on the other hand, modern ecclesiological emphases and pastoral rhetoric regarding the church as the whole overwhelmingly lay people of God. The Vatican II Fathers themselves had asserted dramatically in Apostolicam Actuositatem that modern conditions demand that the laity's apostolate be broadened and intensified, and that the laity is called to perfect the temporal order with the spirit of the gospel, and that in fulfilling this mission of the church, the laity exercise their apostolate both in the church and in the world, in both the spiritual and the temporal orders. Pope John Paul II, later in Christi Fideles Laici, proclaimed that upon the grace and dignity coming from their sacramental incorporation into the church through baptism, the lay faithful participate in the threefold mission of Christ as priest, prophet, and king. Yet at the same time, after going on at length about the laity's sharing in Christ's priesthood and prophetic aspect, and what they can do for the church as the church in these respects, the Holy Father hesitated a bit, in my very humble opinion, when it came to the lay faithful's share in Christ's kingly mission and called to spread the kingdom in history. More than the weight of Catholicism's history and tradition would seem to warrant, he spiritualized and spoke only metaphorically about the laity's kingly mission as an interiorized combat against its own sinfulness, as a posture of service toward neighbors. Saying nothing, as far as I could see, about the perhaps more immediately relevant matter of governance of the whole global people of God. Now, in spite of so much eloquence devoted to the laity and the whole people of God, especially since Vatican II, there is an odd silence in modern Catholic magisterial statements with respect to the laity's traditional, historically rooted rights and duties to help govern and discipline the church body in its simultaneously temporal and ecclesial sphere of existence, temporal and spiritual spheres. In post-revolutionary secularized modernity, even we Catholics, very mindful of history and tradition, have become conceptually impoverished, I would say, when it comes to identifying spaces in which the church and secular society meet and become intertwined and indeed one and the same. We don't sufficiently discern or tend to that all-important space in which the heart of the church's pastoral, moral, and cultural life, beyond the spheres of liturgy and formal worship and teaching of doctrine, etc. This space where the heart of the church's life plays out every day all over the world, and in which relationships among clergy, religious, and the great majority that is the laity develop and become fraught with all too human dilemmas and temptations. Is that space in the church or in the world? Pope Francis and other Catholic leaders today like to speak in missionary terms of sort of the margins of the church. But that doesn't quite seem apt to me for that space wherein the clergy, religious, and laity live an already common life together, both in the world and in the heart of the church. We might call this space the church's seculum, the church's own secular temporal sphere of existence and operation. Identifying it, we can see more clearly how problematic it is that the laity has no serious rights under church law and no organized means to share in its active ordering and regulation, especially where things so basic as safety and justice for children and young seminarians within it are at stake. Some contemporary church leaders, when they talk about a need for greater ecclesial subsidiarity and more lay co-responsibility, may be getting at the same problem I am trying to define from a historical vantage point. In 2009, for example, Pope Benedict XVI lamented that there is still a tendency, long after Vatican II, to identify the church unilaterally with the hierarchy. He went on to say, "It is necessary to improve pastoral structures in such a way that the co-responsibility of all the members of the people of God is promoted. Lay people must no longer be viewed as mere collaborators of the clergy, but truly recognized as co-responsible for the church's being and action." Pope Benedict called indeed for the, quote, consolidation of a more mature and committed laity. Sort of an organizational consolidation is what I believe he was getting at. The bishops have a college of bishops. The laity are not consolidated quite in anywhere near the same way. Now, I don't want to put words in the mouth of our Pope Emeritus, but it seems to me he was suggesting that the time is ripe for the laity, preferably with the encouragement and guidance of a confident clerical hierarchy, not a defensive one, to dig up, dust off, and start exercising their own sword again, within and for the church. But of course, partly because of inertia in the evolved culture of church governance, it's not uncommon for churchmen advocating lay co-responsibility or subsidiarity to get in their own way. When, for example, they close doors or don't respond satisfyingly to serious questions in times of crisis and mass loss of faith in their credibility. Now, as an historian by trade, I hesitate to prescribe fixes for the future with respect, say, to new procedures, canon law revisions, or structural changes churchmen and laypersons might pursue together to help our wounded and scandal-plagued church. But I will at least wrap up by offering two constructive suggestions to all gathered here. First, I think we can all look a lot more and more receptively, with less of a sense that we in the post-Vatican II era sort of have most of the answers. We can look more receptively to the church's rich, complex history, including that of her many unsung, faithful, if not always spectacularly saintly lay members and lesser-known clergy and religious. Some of that history, exciting for members of my profession, is still being recovered and written about. There's still much to learn. In some ways, the age of the laity idea of Vatican II era is making us, I think there's so much to discover about the ways the laity were active in the past. They just didn't make it into sort of the histories of the church in quite the same way. We might even find unexpected treasure in neglected discussions by medieval, Renaissance, and Tridentine authors about things like Christian kingship or the role of temporal lay leaders in protecting, disciplining, and growing the church. Now, I'm not saying this like an integralist, saying we should take this literally and go in impracticable political terms, of course. But I think we could plumb some older ideas of Christian kingship or leadership for the laity, we can plumb them for ecclesiological insights related to lay clerical co-responsibility. The Council of Trent, for example, assumed as a given that lay leaders had a central role to play in advancing, restoring, and preserving unimpaired, authentic ecclesiastical discipline among the Christian people. That they, as Catholics, were willed by God to be protectors of the Holy Faith and the Church. Even medieval popes, as jealous of clerical authority as the reformer Gregory VII, famous for slapping down an emperor during the investiture controversy, upheld in the midst of all that a robust concept of lay Christian temporal lordship, never questioning that good Christian laymen can, quote, reign with Christ. Also, in the examples I offered earlier of medieval and early modern laypersons helping to discipline wayward clergy, a key principle at work was that secular authorities in Catholic polities were understood not simply to be merely political officials, acting somehow external to or separate from the church per se. They were understood to be leading baptized laymen, sometimes laywomen, whose offices implied a duty to protect the church's members in their temporal common life as the living body of Christ. When trying and punishing some clergymen, lay leaders then weren't, according to understandings of the day, acting outside of or in opposition to the church. They were acting within and for the church. They were acting ecclesially and fully in a lay capacity. How modest things like independently operating lay-run review boards, allowed powers of discovery and financial oversight by chanceries or bishops' conferences seem in comparison to this. Yet how difficult it is to get authorization from upper management for them in this very modern post-Vatican II church. Second, I think we would do well to face up to the stark possibility that despite much fine talk about it since Vatican II, we may not actually be living in a great age of the laity after all. Rather, we may be living in an age of a disoriented, disenfranchised, and in some respects merely more clericalized laity, caught helplessly at times between the behemoth modern secular state and global superculture and the hyper-bureaucratized, centralized, and clericalized juridical structures of our church at the national and global levels. Tragically, for so many, this has led to an attenuation or an abandonment of the Catholic faith. And those laypersons in the meantime who wish to remain faithful and engaged may not so much be emancipated as led too much along and constrained by a bureaucratically bloated, often unresponsive and self-referential, sometimes worldly, more than truly apostolic-minded clerical hierarchy. To be sure, church leaders over many decades have made overtures to some members of the laity, but often dishearteningly when it's simply convenient or helps to gel chummy relations with cosmopolitan elites who reject much of what the church stands for. It almost appears at times that our clerical hierarchy defaults more than ever these days to pay, pray, and obey laity when we start asking serious questions, for example, about who knew what and when, about sexual crimes against children, or about sexual harassment and exploitation of young clergymen, or about whose money or job promotion was used to pay off whom and for what. To truly help the church, we should face up to such difficult truths and not pretend that there are any easy fixes in sight. But facing up to difficult truths is an act of hope, not despair. In that spirit, let me close with some words from Blessed John Henry Newman that express what I feel concerned faithful laypersons, as well as clergymen who support more genuine clerical lay co-responsibility, need to hear during this period of ongoing crisis. Your strength lies in your God and in your conscience, Newman said to the Catholic laity of England of his time. I want you to rouse yourselves to understand where you are, to know yourselves. I would aim primarily at organization, edification, cultivation of mind, growth of reason. because it is a moral force which will vindicate your profession and will secure your triumph. I want a laity, Newman went on, who know their religion, who enter into it, who know just where they stand, who know just what they hold and what they do not, who know their creed so well that they can give an account of it, who know so much of history that they can defend it. In all times, he said, the laity have been the measure of the Catholic spirit. They saved the Irish Church 3 centuries ago, and they betrayed the Church in England, unquote. Now, I truly believe that Cardinal Newman and many other good men and women of the Church, clerical and lay, are watching from the other side, praying for today's laity and clergy. Because we too, the laity today, have an opportunity, especially if the Pope and bishops allow us to step up and exercise for the Church more of our many gifts, including our capacity for tough love toward faltering spiritual fathers who are needed to help save the Church again in the USA and across the world in the 21st century.
We again have about 20 minutes for questions and conversation. I will again start with a couple of questions here and then see if we have any from online. So, questions, and again, a microphone will be brought to you. Yes, over here. Yes, there.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. It appears to me, after the sessions this morning, that those laity who are sad, a bit angry, and want to stay and help face a fork in the road. We can either accept the premise that the church hierarchical organizational structure, as President Garvey said, it's a monarchy, and the basic authority of the clergy over laity and the lack of authority of laity over clergy are non-negotiable. That's one fork, which leads us to advisory committees and trying to help very informally. Or we can reject that, and what I think I just heard you say is try to reclaim authority by the laity over clergy in some fashions. Did I understand the premise?
Please indicate also who you're asking the question to. I presume that was to Dr. McShea. Very good.
Yes, I was not suggesting that the laity need to reclaim authority over the clergy, but shared authority, shared power in a sense. I actually don't think that word is always terrible from a historical point of view. I would actually not necessarily agree with the way you framed it. The idea of a monarchy, a church as a monarchy, we might actually look back to actual Catholic monarchies where the laity actually had a lot more power, at least some of them. They got to select bishops, they patronized pastors. We sort of, when we use the word monarchy in the modern context, I think we kind of associate something in opposition to anything related to kind of shared power, shared duties. But if you actually go back into the tradition historically, the church as an absolute monarchy in the past sort of did delegate a lot of its day-to-day business to a range of people, not just bishops, but also abbots, monastic leaders, the lay princes of Christendom. So I actually don't think the opposition is quite as stark as the question suggests. And this is why I advocate, let's go back and look at history more. We may get unexpected insights from past contexts that help us not have to. I don't question the hierarchical structure of the church whatsoever. I do think it's become kind of weighted too much in the clerical episcopal direction, sort of by historical happenstance, as sort of political society and social life became more and more secularized, sort of leaving the faithful kind of stranded in the middle, in a sense. So maybe it's an idea of rethinking. When we say the church, we do still think too much of sort of the bishops and the leading officials, and that's quite in contrast with the people of God idea, which is not just a modern idea. It goes back very far in the tradition, just with different phrases, the Christian people, the body of the church, etc. So,
A question over here in the back.
Oh, okay. My question is, you were talking about the context of the situation today, and I was thinking, looking at the situation from a different angle. One is that we have a culture where critical thinking among people is lacking. And then the other thing is that maybe we should look at the strength of the secular people and not look at it within the church, or inside the church. Because I did a research yesterday and actually wrote an article. The problem of the sexual abuses of the priests. I don't think many people know a lot of the recidivism, meaning the tendency to reoffend. There's a pedophilia, which means attraction to younger people. So it's easy for the society to condemn that, oh, these priests are evil. But who's really defending the priests or the Catholic clergy? So what I'm thinking is that the secular people need to find their own strength. If their strength is psychological strength, if their strength is in the media, if their strength is in making political decisions, then they should focus on that instead of usually blaming the Catholic Church for its lacking or for its shortcomings or for its negligence. And then once it operates from strength from both sides, then it can collaborate or it can cooperate or it can work on better together. That's the question. Or do you just want to give a reaction? Thank you.
Here, do you have a reaction to that? I mean, I generally agree. As my remarks implied, I do believe the strengths of. I was thinking of the secular dimension of the church's life, not necessarily secular in the sense of outside the church. I think the problem is that there needs to be ways for them to actually help the church and to exercise their gifts. And so some of these structural issues, I think, it's not blaming the church, it's trying to point out and diagnose something that maybe needs to be dealt with. So, and I think that's all I have to say, I guess.
Dr. Ruddy, you want to say something to that?
I get worried when I hear sort of, I get worried when I hear sort of us against them arguments in terms of the church with this. I think the sense of the church as communion doesn't mean that there's no conflict in the church, but I do think there's a problem when we start trying to sort of get power over each other, assert each other in this sense. I say this as a lay person, and what I mean by that is that it winds up in a competitive situation that people are squabbling for turf. I also have questions about, in this sense, about I think you might say about the role of the secular, the laity, in terms of church governance with this, is that we see from another angle. We see in China right now and other places. We see the potential dangers of the church giving over the control to name its own bishops in the face of very hostile regimes. And so I would be a little bit concerned about anything that would delegate to civil authorities any sort of say over the nomination of bishops with that. And I think that the key then is, in some ways, I think, might be found in something like the rule of St. Benedict, in the way that it speaks about the abbot. The abbot has almost unlimited authority in his community, or the abbess. But he is very strongly enjoined and even required to consult with all the members of the community, especially the youngest, whenever a matter of grave importance is facing the community. And I think in that sense, we can see a way in which a model that the church is monarchical in its divine constitution. This is the way Christ has set up the church. But if we view monarchy as a sort of Louis XIV, I am the state, then we've got a problem. If we view it as in a more Benedictine or abbatial terms, I think, then we can see a way in which true leadership in fatherhood or motherhood can coexist with the involvement and the fostering of everybody in the community. So I would go in that direction.
Matthew, do you have an online question for
The question for Professor Ruddy. Later in Lumen Gentium, you quoted it earlier and you have it on your worksheet, it recommends that the laity remedy the customs and conditions of the world if they are an inducement to sin. How does the laity remedy the sinful customs and conditions inside the church that led to the crisis?
First, personally, you have to ask yourself how faithful are you? Are you seeking the Lord? Are you praying? Are you fasting? Are you serving? Are you loving? The bread and butter. Then I think, then it goes alongside that and not in competition. I think just speaking forthrightly. I think Catholic culture has a very difficult time with public disagreement. I think that arises out of a good instinct to stay together, not to fracture, not to splinter. Unity is an enormous gift that I think Catholics can sometimes take for granted, especially when looking at other Christian communities and the struggles that they face with disunity. But the flip side of that is that we often don't know how to disagree in public in ways that are constructive or that are not seen as being disloyal or divisive or so on. And I think in that sense, what laity can do, especially laity in some senses, to be very blunt, whose jobs may not necessarily depend on the goodwill of church leaders, have the opportunity and I think also the duty to speak out more forthrightly about that. I thought something that Bronwen mentioned is very significant. I think the removal of the imposition of term limits on pastors has a very significant effect on the ability of priests to offer honest and unvarnished counsel to their bishops. Certainly they can still do it, but they will have to suffer sometimes various consequences. Part of that you might say is, well, be a big boy about that and take the hit. But it shouldn't have to be a sort of supererogatory thing. There should be built into the structures of the church, there should be some way in which the clergy of a diocese have some more substantial way of supporting and, where necessary, challenging their bishops and leaders. I would say that.
And now here.
So I think that your comments have been absolutely wonderful, both of you, and I agree largely with them. In a very practical sense, as a parish priest, one of the questions that comes up in my mind is, which laity? Because I grew up in a diocese that was in shambles, in a parish that had a lot of lay involvement by people who seemed to impose themselves upon us and were trying to force a cultural agenda that the parish wasn't interested in. I know this is a loaded term, I don't want to use it as such, but a sort of spirit of Vatican II agenda that was, and it's a miracle that I'm a priest as a result of this, because we didn't go to church very much as a result. And I've served in parishes where I've had laity who it's like, yes, these people are great to work with, it's wonderful, I want to put everything in their hands and do nothing but write homilies. And, because the bishop moves us, I've served in parishes where I have been under the assault of the laity simply for doing what the missal says, without any embellishment. So which laity are we to choose, and how are we to choose those people to lead us in the way that the Council truly envisioned as enshrined in John Paul II and Benedict?
Well, I don't have a simple answer to that. I do think one way we should not choose them is to have most of the sort of a lot of the laity have gotten. I'm not an expert in the modern situation. I am a historian. The chanceries themselves sometimes choose the laity who have influence at various levels, right? I mean, so it's the laity that sometimes emerge in some context are not necessarily being chosen by a mix of people within the church. So I don't think. I mean, there are many cases of sort of faithful lay people, their initiatives being, a big NO coming from chanceries or coming from a higher level in the church. So I feel like if we had a more lay involvement, you'd have a larger mix of it. You'd still have various issues. I wouldn't say otherwise. But I'm also not comfortable leaving the status quo as it is exactly, because, I mean, we have clearly before us, we can't necessarily trust the hierarchy per se either. So, I mean, you can sort of give lots of examples of lay people going amiss, running amok, as you might put it. But we have plenty of people with actual control in the church also running amok or not doing their job properly. So I feel like if more of us were involved in some way, some of these problems would sort themselves out, maybe more at a local level instead of having to make it a kind of, the whole church needs to be involved in every single instance of it. So I don't know. I don't know if you have something to add to that more.
It's easy for me to say because I'm not a pastor or in a position of responsibility with that, but I know that in canon law, the pastor is responsible for everybody in his territory, Catholics and non-Catholic. Obviously, his relationship to the different people in his territory will be different. But my instinct in that sense is to say, you don't get to choose your laity. You have to work with what you have. You know, I'm a father. I love my sons. Sometimes they can drive me up the wall. I can drive them up the wall. I don't get to choose my children. I have to, and they don't get to choose me. And we're in this together. And I think that in this sense, there's a tension that can hopefully be productive, although it can be divisive, which is that you have to go out to the one that is lost. Obviously, you have to attend to everybody, including the people who are most frustrating. At the same time, there's also a way in which Jesus is at certain points willing to let people go. Not willingly, but he won't back down about the bread of life discourse. He could have held things together by softening things, but he doubled down. And he did so because of something of crucial importance was at stake. And how a pastor negotiates that or works that sort of tension between attending to everyone, including especially the lost sheep, but then also being able to draw a line or say this is what we need, and then in a particular way having backup from his bishop is important with that. Priests really, I've seen this more and more, just how much even priests who aren't necessarily close to their bishops, they really feel it when they don't feel that the bishop has their back. It's a real profound wound and a pain for them. And so in that sense, I think you've got to go for all the lay people. You also need the pastoral wisdom over time to know when you say, we can't go further than this. And that's the art of pastoral leadership, I think.
There's a question here.
Oh, okay. I feel a little bit like Alice in Wonderland because I'm mystified by the apparent response of the hierarchy to the problem. They're saying, "Oh my gosh, we got a problem." This is at least the fifth time this is going around where we know we have a problem, and they should have dealt with it before. The cardinal said that he had gotten 1,000 letters. I thought he said, and I'd be willing to bet that a lot of those letters dealt with these problems as well as many other problems that the church is having. I'm kind of opposed to bureaucratic responses to this because I used to run committees for a living, and committees are difficult to deal with, and I would be willing to bet that the church has gotten suggestions in all these letters that they have received about what needs to be done. We also have a lot of publications that have come out talking about problems in the church. I don't know, 16, 18 years ago, there was a book put out called Goodbye, Good Men. And it talked about the problem of homosexuality in seminaries. And little aside, I wrote a letter to Cardinal McCarrick advising him to read this book. I bet he got a good laugh out of that. I also get regularly the Cardinal Newman Society newsletter. They have been talking for at least 15 years about the problems in Catholic universities, where Catholic universities have become, not this university, but Catholic universities generally have become very secular. I also get a magazine called the New Oxford Review, and they have been talking for 20 years about the problems of the church. And I cannot imagine anybody in the hierarchy saying, why didn't somebody tell me about this? We've known about these problems for a long time. I don't know why they haven't solved them. Maybe they are unsolvable. Can you,
Chris first and then Dr.
Okay. Just briefly, I think the reason I haven't spoken to the president or other people in administration here at Catholic U, but I don't think we would be having this conference if it hadn't been for Archbishop McCarrick. I thought that Cardinal DiNardo's comments about the mail that he received are on the money. I think that's the new element right now, and I think that this time around, the issue is not so directly the sexual abuse of minors, although that remains an ongoing gaping wound. But it's just the extent, as I said. I'm a church insider. I work for the church. I teach theology here. I have a canonical mission and so forth. The stuff surrounding Archbishop McCarrick has been, as I said, by far the most deflating. I mean, I knew that this stuff happened. I'd heard the rumors about him, over 10 years ago, actually 15 years ago. But then actually to see it come out and to see what followed from that, I think it's just, we're in a new stage right now, and that's the new dimension, I think.
Yeah, I would just add, Christopher, I appreciated what you said before, but sometimes working with the bishops, sometimes the lay people felt like they were being told, oh, well, we really know how things work, so, let us, so that message comes out clearly when it's convenient. We also have churchmen they're incredibly well-educated, worldly men. They've seen a lot of the world. They have great degrees from pontifical universities and other universities. So when I see statements that sort of have this quality like, gee whiz, there's a problem, I didn't realize this, it tends to ring a little false with me. So that's all I can say to that. So.
Let us thank our speakers.